Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and my channel is Discerning What is True. Today is the first day of March 2023. My talk is going to be on Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. That is Chapter 7. Hope everyone is doing well. Um Weather was quite warm today here where I live at. Somewhat cloudy, but still warm, especially for March first day. In the high 70s today, temperature wise Fahrenheit. Yes, too warm for this time of year for sure. Uh, Hope you guys are doing well. I want to uh, share this continually as that the author Anthony C. Sutton goes into what I call a very detailed records, trying to discover this information. I'm sure that some of this stuff is now even more out there. If someone has the time and money and effort to do this, they could probably find out even more. Um, anyway, let's get to the whole book here, and this is the Bolsheviks return to New York. It's chapter 7. This is a quote. Martins is very much in the limelight. There appears to be no doubt about his connection with the Guarantee, that is, trust company, that is Guarantee, though it is surprising that so large and influential enterprise should have dealings with a Bolshevik concern. This is a report from the Scotland Yard Intelligence Report in London, 1919. So this has actually been over 100 years ago. Following on the initial successes of the revolution, the Soviets wasted little time in attempting through former U.S. residents to establish diplomatic relations with and propaganda outlets in the United States. In June 1918, the American consulate in Harbinton, cabled Washington. Albert R. Williams, bearer of the department's passport, May 15, 1917, proceeding United States to establish Information Bureau for Soviet government for which he has written authority. Shall I visa? Washington denied the visa, and so Williams was unsuccessful in his attempt to establish an information bureau here. Williams was followed by Alexander Nyberg, alias Santario Urteva, as spelled Nuorteva, a former Finnish immigrant to the United States in January 1912, who became the first operative Soviet representative in the United States. Neilberg was an active propagandist, that is. In fact, in 1919, he was, according to J. Edward Hoover, in a letter to the U.S. Committee on Foreign Affairs, the forerunner of the LCAK Martins anti with Gregory Weinstein, the most active individual of official Bolshevik propaganda in the United States. Neilberg was none too successful as a diplomatic representative or ultimately as a propagandist. The State Department files record an interview with Neilberg by the Consular Office dated January 29, 1919. Neilberg was accompanied by H. Kelly, that is, described as an American citizen, graduate of Harvard, and more surprising by Mr. McFarland, an attorney for the Hearst organization. The State Department, you know who owns Hearst, they're involved in newspapers at that time. The State Department records show that Neilberg made many misstatements in regard to the attitude to the Bolshevik government and claimed that Peters, the LETT terrorist police chief in Petrograd, was merely a kind-hearted poet. Neilberg requested the department to cable Lenin on the theory that it might be helpful in revealing about the conference proposal by the Allies at Paris. The proposed message, a rambling appeal to Lenin to gain international acceptance appearing at the Paris conference, was not sent. A raid on the Soviet Bureau in New York. Alexander Neilberg was then let go and replaced by the Soviet Bureau, which was established in early 1919 in the World Tower building. at 110 West 40th Street in New York City. The Bureau was headed by a German citizen, Ludwig C.A.K. Martens, Martens, who was usually billed as the first ambassador of the Soviet Union in the United States, and who up to that time had been vice president of Weinberg and Posner, a engineering firm located at 120 Broadway, New York City, while the ambassador and his offices were located in New York rather than Washington, D.C. Was not explained. Interesting. It does suggest that trade rather than diplomatic was his primary objective. In any event, the Bureau promptly issued a call lot Russian trade with the United States. Industry had collapsed and Russia directly needed machinery, railway goods, and clothing, chemicals, drugs, indeed everything utilized by a modern society or civilization. In exchange, the Soviets offered gold and raw materials. The Soviet Bureau then proceeded to arrange contracts with American firms, ignoring the facts of the embargo and non-recognition. At the same time, it was providing financial support for the emerging Communist Party of the USA. So they killed their own economy. You see, they destroyed it. That would be more. That would be not what they would also kill. They would also be involved in killing their own citizens. On May 7, 1919, the State Department slapped down business intervention in behalf of the Bureau, noted elsewhere, and repudiated Ludwig Martens, the Soviet Bureau, and the Bolshevik government of Russia. This official rebuttal did not deter the eager order hunters in American industry. When the Soviet Bureau office were raided on June 12, 1919, by representatives of the Lusk Committee of the state of New York, files of letters to and from American businessmen representing almost 1,000 firms were unearthed. The British Home Office Directorial Intelligence Special Report Number 5, secret, issued from Scotland Yard's London, July 14, 1919, and written by Basil H. Thompson, was based on the seizure material, the report notes. Every effort was made from the first by Martens and his associates to arouse the interest of American capitalists, and there are grounds to believing that the Bureau has received financial support from some Russian export firms, as well as from the Guarantee Trust Company, although this firm has denied the allegation that it is financing Martens' organizations. It was noted by Thompson that the monthly rent of the Soviet Bureau offices was $300, and the office salaries came to about $4,000. Martens' funds to pay these bills came partly from Soviet couriers, such as John Reed and Michael Kreuzberg, who brought diamonds from Russia for sale in the United States, and partly from American business firms, including the Guarantee Trust Company of New York. It makes me wonder why in the world would they actually meet in New York, but when he's, instead of Washington. But they're not seeking diplomatic terms here. They're seeking financial terms. They're seeking the South. They're seeking all kinds of things that the West has, especially from the United States. The British report summarized the files seized by the Lusk investigators from the Bureau offices, and this summary is worth quoting in full. 1. There was a intrigue afoot about the time the president first wanted to fight France to get the administration to use Nuremberg as a intermediate with the Russian Soviet government with a view to bring about its recognition by America. Endeavor was made to bring Colonel House into it, and there is a long and interesting letter to Frederick C. Howe on whose support and sympathy Navarro appeared to rely. There are other records connecting Howe with Martens and Navarro. There is a file of correspondence with Eugene Debs. A letter from Amos Pickett, Pinchot, Pinchot, to William Kent of the U.S. Tariff Commission, to an envelope addressed to Senator Lenroot, introduced Evans Clark, now in the Bureau of the Russian Soviet Republic. He wants to talk to you about the recognition of Kolchak, Kolchak, and the raising of the blockade, etc. 4. A report to Felix Frankfurter, dated 27th day of May 1919, speaks of the virulent campaign vilifying the Russian government. 5. There is considerable correspondence between the Colonel and Mrs. Raymond Robbins and Notaro, both in 1918 and 1919. In July 1918, Mrs. Robbins asked Notaro for articles for Life and Labor, the organ of the National Women's Trade League. In February and March of 1919, Notaro tried through Robbins to get invited to give evidence before the Obermann Committee. He also wanted Robbins to denounce the Siskins documents. 6. In a letter from the Janssen Cloth Products Company, that is in New York, to Notaro, dated March 30th, 1918, E. Werner Knudsen, Knudsen, says that he understands that Notaro intends to make arrangements for the export of foodstuffs through Finland, and he offers his services. We have a file on Knudsen, who passed information to and from Germany by way of Mexico with regard to British shipping. Ludwig Martins, the intelligence report continued, was in touch with all the leaders of the left in the United States, including John Reed, Ludwig Lohr, and Harry J. Boland, the Irish rebel. A vigorous campaign against Alexandria Kolchak in Siberia had been organized by Martin, the report concludes. Martin's organization is a powerful weapon for supporting the Bolshevik cause in the United States, and he is in close touch with the promoters of political unrest throughout the whole American continent. So what's going on here? Now they've kind of got themselves on what I would call stable ground in Russia. They're already interested in overthrowing other governments. They already are moving in that direction. You can see this by already they're coming here and starting to try to infiltrate this country. Martin's organization is a powerful weapon for supporting Bolsheviks' cause in the United States, and he is in close touch with the promoters of political unrest throughout the whole American continent. So this is what they're trying to do. They're going to come back here and cause instability. The Scotland Yard list of personnel employed by Soviet Bureau in New York coincides quite closely with similar lists in the Lusk, L-U-S-K, committee files in Albany, New York, which are today open for public inspection. That is, there is one essential difference between the two lists. The British analysts included the name Julius Hammer, whereas Hammer was omitted from the Lusk committee report. The British report characterized Julius Hammer as follows. Julius Hammer, Martins as a real Bolshevik and ardent left-wing adherent who came not long ago from Russia. He was one of the organizers of the left-wing movement in New York and speaks at meetings on the same platform with such left-wing leaders as Reed, Harwich, Lohr, and Larkin. There also exists other evidence of Hammer's work in behalf of the Soviets. A letter from National City Bank of New York to the U.S. Treasury Department stated that documents received by the bank from Martins were witnessed by a Dr. Julius Hammer for the acting director of the financial department of the Soviet Bureau. The Hammer family has had close ties with Russia and the Soviet regime from 1917 to the present. Now, that Hammer company is Armour Hammer. Is today able to acquire the most lucrative of Soviet contracts. Jacob, that is the grandfather of Armour Hammer, and Julius were born in Russia. Armand, Harry, and Victor, sons of Julius, were born in the United States and are U.S. citizens. Victor was a well-known artist. His son, also named Armand, and granddaughter are Soviet citizens and reside in the Soviet Union. Armand Hammer is chairman of the Occidental Petroleum Corporation. Didn't know that. And has a son called Julian, who is director of advertising and publications for Occidental Petroleum. Julius Hammer was a prominent member and financial of the left wing of the Socialist Party. And his 1919 convention, Hammer served with Bertrand de Wolfe and Benjamin Gitlow on the steering committee that gave birth to the Communist Party of the United States. You get the picture here, folks? This is already becoming pretty serious. And everybody doesn't seem to be watching what's going on, but it's enormously involved. And this all connects, folks. It all connects back to, again, with Woodrow Wilson and the bankers who met at Jekyll Island to create the Federal Reserve System, which is not federal, not reserve, and it's not a system. It's the way of robbing the American people, and have been doing that for over 100 years. In 1920, Julius Hammer was given a sentence of 3½ to 15 years in Sing Sing for criminal abortion. Lennon suggested with justification that Julius was in prison on the charge of practicing legal abortions, but in fact, because of communism. Other U.S. Communist Party's members were sentenced to jail for sedition or deported to the Soviet Union. Soviet representatives in the United States made strenuous but unsuccessful efforts to have Julius and his fellow party members released. Another prominent member of the Soviet Bureau was the Assistant Secretary Kenneth Durand, a former aide to Colonel House. In 1920, Durand was identified as a Soviet courier. Appendix 3 reproduces a letter to Kenneth Durand that was seized by the U.S. Department of Justice in 1920, and that describes Durand's close relationship with the Soviet hierarchy. It was inserted into the record of a House committee hearing in 1920 with the following commentary. Mr. Newton, it is a mailer of interest to the committee to know what was the nature of that letter, and I have a copy of that letter that I want inserted in the record in connection with the witness testimony. Mr. Mason, that letter has never been shown to the witness. He said that he never saw the letter, and he has asked to see it, and that the department has refused to show it to him. We would not put any witness on the stand and ask him to testify to a letter without seeing it. Mr. Newton, the witness testified that he has such a letter, and he testified that they found it in his coat in the trunk. I believe that letter was addressed to a Mr. Kenneth Durand, and that letter has within it another envelope, which was likewise sealed. They were opened by the government officials and a photostatic copy made. The letter, I may say, is signed by a man by the name of Bill. It refers specifically to Soviet monies on deposit in Christiania, Norway, a portion of which they waste turned over here to officials of the Soviet government in this country. Kenneth Durand, who acted as Soviet courier in the transfer of funds, was treasurer lot, that is, the Soviet Bureau, and press secretary and publisher of the Soviet Russia, the official organ of the Soviet Bureau. Durand came from a well-to-do Philadelphia family. He spent most of his life in the services of the Soviets, first in charge of publicity work as the Soviet Bureau News, that is, not Soviet News, I'm sorry, Soviet Bureau, then from 1923 to 1944 as manager of the Soviet Task Bureau in the United States. J. Edward Hoover described Durand as at all times particularly active in the interests of Martins and of the Soviet government. Felix Frankfurter, later Justice of the Supreme Courts, and by the way, Felix Frankfurter is a Jew, was also prominent in the Soviet Bureau files. A letter from Frankfurter to Soviet agent Notarial is produced in Appendix 3 and suggests that Frankfurter has some influence with the Bureau. In brief, the Soviet Bureau could not have been established without influential assistance from within the United States. Part of the assistance came from specific influential appointments to the Soviet Bureau staff, and part came from business firms outside the Bureau, firms that were reluctant to make their support publicly known. Corporate allies for the Soviet Bureau. On February 1st, 1920, the front page of the New York Times came a box notation stating that Martins was to be arrested and deported to Russia. At the same time, Martins was being sought as a witness to appear before a subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee investigating Soviet activity in the United States. After lying low for a few days, Martins appeared before the committee, claimed diplomatic privilege, and refused to give up official papers in his possession. Then, after a flurry of publicity, Martins relented, handed over his papers, admitted to revolutionary activities in the United States with the ultimate aim of overthrowing the capitalist system. Martins boasted to the news media and Congress that big corporations, the Chicago Packers among them, were aiding the Soviets. Wow, he's a daredevil here. According to Martins, instead of fathering on propaganda among the radicals and the proletariat, he had addressed most of the efforts to winning to the side of Russia. The big business and manufacturing interests of this country, the Packers, the United States Steel Corporation, the Standard Oil Company, and other big concerns engaged in international trade. Martins asserted that most of the big business houses of the country were aiding him in his efforts to get the government to recognize the Soviet government. This claim was expanded by A. Heller, Heller, commercial attaché of the Soviet Bureau. Among the people helping us to get recognition from the State Department are the big Chicago Packers. This is here's a list of some of these large corporations. You'll know some of them. Armour was one of those. I don't know if Armour is still in business. Swift, I think, is gone. It's been bought out. Nelson Morris and Cuddly, among the other firms, are the American Steel Export Company, the Lehigh Machine Company, the Adrian Knitting Company, the International Harvester Company, wow, the Aluminum Goods Manufacturing Company, the Aluminum Company of America, which is ALCO, the American Car and Foundry Export Company, which is, I think, makes railroad cars, is what I understand, and MCD Borden and Sons. I don't know if that's Borden Milk. I don't think that's them. It must be something else. The New York Times followed up these claims and reported comments of the firm's name. I have never heard of the man as Martins before in my life, declared G.F. Swift Jr., in charge of the export department of Swift and Company. Most certainly, I am sure that we have never had any dealings with him of any kind. The Times added that O.H. Swift, the only other member of the firm that could be contacted, also denied any knowledge whatever of Martins or his bureau in New York. The Swift statement was evasive at best. With the Lusk Committee investigators seized the Soviet Bureau files, they found correspondence between the Bureau and almost all the firms named by Martins and Heller. The list of firms that offered to do business with Russia Soviet Bureau compiled from these files, including a entry page 16, Swift and Company, United Stock Yards, Chicago, Illinois. In other words, Swift had been in communication with Martins despite his denial to the New York Times. The New York Times contacted the United States Steel and reported. Judge Albert H. Gray said last night that there was no foundation for the statement with the Soviet represented here and had any dealings with the United States Steel Corporation. This is technically correct. The United States Steel Corporation is not listed in the Soviet files, but the list does contain, in page 16, an affiliate. That is United States Steel Products Company, 30th Church Street, New York City. The Lusk Committee lists records the following about other firms mentioned by Martins and Heller, that is Standard Oil, not listed, Armour Company, Meat Packers, listed as Armour Leather, and Armour and Company, Union Stock Yards in Chicago, Morris Company, Meat Packers, that is, listed on page 13, Cuddly, listed on page 6, American Steel Export Company, listed on page 2, is located at the Woolworth Building. It had offered to trade with USSR, that is, Lehigh Machine Company, not listed, Adrian Knitting Company, listed on page 1, International Harvester Company, listed on page 17, Aluminum Goods Manufacturing Company, listed on page 1, Aluminum Company of America, not listed, American Car and Foundry Export, the closest listing is American Car Company of Philadelphia. And in MCD, Borden and Sons listed at location at 90 Worth Street on page 4. So there are a couple of companies that are not listed here, is what they're saying. Then on Saturday, June 21st, 1919, Santero Norvello, that is Andersana Nauberg, confirmed in the press review that the role of international harvester. Question: what is your business? A. Purchasing director of the Soviet Union. What do you do to accomplish this? I address myself to American manufacturers. Question: name them. Answer: International Harvester Corporation is among them. Question: whom did you see? Mr. Colling. Answer: question: did you go to see him? Yes. Question: give more names. I went to see so many, about 500 people. I can't remember all the names. Interesting. We have files in the office disclosing them. In brief, claims by Heller and Martins relating to their widespread contacts among certain U.S. firms were substantiated by the office files of the Soviet Bureau. On the other hand, for their own good reasons, these firms appeared unwilling to confirm their activities. Next section: European bankers and the Bolsheviks. In addition to Guaranty Trust and the private banker Bolshevik in New York, some European bankers gave direct help to maintain and expand the Bolsheviks' hold on Russia. So it's not only the United States is involved in cahoots with these people, that is bankers, but now we're seeing certain bankers in Europe are also involved. A 1918 State Department report from Stockholm Embassy details these financial transfers. The department commended it its author, stating that his reports on conditions in Russia, the spread of Bolshevism in Europe, and financial questions have proved most helpful to the department. The department is much gratified by your capable handling of the litigation business. According to this report, one of these Bolshevik bankers acting on behalf of the emerging Soviet regime was Dmitry Rubinstein. Interesting name of the former Russo-French bank in Petrograd. Rubinstein, an associate of the notorious Grigol Rasputin, had been jailed in pre-revolutionary Petrograd in connection with the sale of the Second Russian Life Insurance Company. The American manager and director of the Second Russian Life Insurance Company was John McGregory Grant, who was located at 120 Broadway, New York City. Grant was also the New York representative of Pudov, Baikal, Russian Asiatic Tea. In August of 1918, Grant was, for unknown reasons, listed on the Military Intelligence Bureau suspect list. This may have occurred because Olaf Ashkeberg in early 1918 reported opening a foreign credit in Petrograd with the John McGregor Grant Company, export concern, which is Ashkeberg finances in Sweden and which is financed in America by the Guaranty Trust Company. After the revolution, Dmitry Rubinstein moved to Stockholm and became financial agent for the Bolsheviks. The State Department noted that while Rubinstein was not a Bolshevik, he had been unscrupulous in money making, and is suspected that he may be making the contemplated visit to America in Bolshevik interest and for Bolshevik pay. Another Stockholm Bolshevik banker was Abraham Gibastovsky, brother-in-law of Trotsky and Lev Kamenke. Let's say this guy because this is a famous guy. Let's see if I can get it right. Because he was actually a butcher. Lev is Lev, Kamenev. Kamenev. The State Department reports asserted that while Gibastovsky pretended to be very anti-Bolshevik, he had in fact received large sums of money from the Bolsheviks by courier for financial revolutionary operations. Gibastovsky was part of the syndicate that included Denskal of the former Siberian Bank and Kameniko of the Osko Don Bank and Dabakal of the Bank of Foreign Commerce. This syndicate sold the assets of the former Siberian Bank to the British government. Nothing like taking and giving. Yet another czarist private banker, Gregory Lesenine, handled Bolshevik business through the firm of Darntel and Hadborg. Other Bolshevik bankers named in the report are Sterner and Jacob Bartin, who previously controlled through his wife the Petrograph Nelikans Bank, and also Isidore Khan was used by these bankers as an agent. The most interesting of these Europe-based bankers operating on behalf of the Bolsheviks was Gregory Benson, spelled Beneson, formerly chairman in Petrograph of the Russian and English Bank, a bank which included on its board of directors Lord Balfour. You never hear a name, folks, that's a red flag. Very important name. Who was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in England. You know anything about Israeli situation and what took place after the war, that is World War I, Lord Balfour is a key individual. And Sir I.M.H. Armour, A-M-O-R-Y, as well as S.H. Cribbs and H. Gedalia Benson traveled to Petrograph after the revolution, then on to Stockholm. He came, said one State Department official, bringing to my knowledge 10 million rubles with him as he offered them to me at a high price for the use of our embassy in Archangel. Benson had an arrangement with the Bolsheviks to exchange 60 million rubles for 1.5 million sterling. It's nothing like people at the top, because all they care about is money, and they don't care about anything to do with the people. In January 1919, it's the same thing today, folks. It's the same fucking thing. In January 1919, the private bankers in Copenhagen that were associated with Bolshevik institutions became alarmed by rumors that the Danish political police had marked the Soviet legation and those persons in contact with the Bolsheviks for expulsion from Denmark. These bankers and legation hastily attempted to remove their funds from Danish banks, and in particular 7 million rubles from the Revisen Banker. Also, confidential documents were hidden in the offices of the Martin Larsen Insurance Company. Consequently, we can identify a pattern of assistance by capitalist bankers for the Soviet Union. Some of these were American bankers, some were Tsarist bankers who were exiled and living in Europe, and some were, hear that? And some were European bankers. Their common objective was profit, not ideology. The questionable aspect of the work of these Bolshevik bankers, as they were called, arises from the framework of contemporary events in Russia. In 1919, French, British, and American troops were fighting Soviet troops in the Archangel region. In one clash, I should say, in April of 1919, for example, American casualties were 1 officer, 5 men killed, and 9 missing. Indeed, at one point in 1919, General Tasker H. Bliss, the U.S. commander in Archangel, affirmed the British statement that Allied troops in the Murmansk and Archangel district were in danger of extermination unless they were specially reinforced. Reinforcements were then on the way under the command of Brigadier General W.P. Richardson. In brief, while guaranteed trust in first-rank American firms were assisting the formation of the Soviet Bureau in New York, American troops were in conflict with Soviet troops in North Russia. Moreover, these conflicts were daily reported in the New York Times, presumably read by these bankers and businessmen. Further, as we shall see in Chapter 10, the financial circles that were supporting the Soviet Bureau in New York also formed in New York the United Americans, a virtually anti-communist organization predicting bloody revolution, mass starvation, and panic in the streets of New York. Just like what they would do, they would also play both sides here. That's what they're doing. So that is chapter 7. Hope that you enjoyed it. I'm going to take a little brief break here, and we'll see if we can go with chapter 8 tonight. This is really interesting. No surprises here, except a few people here. I think the one that really stood out to me was actually in chapter 7, when he mentioned a particular person here, and I've just forgotten his name off the top of my head, who was involved. Well, we know that Arm & Hammer was somewhat of a surprise. um, which is also to do with Mr. Gore. His family was involved in that too. Now, I don't know, that's before his time, so I don't know if that's still true, but that is a company that he has come from. And it's kind of interesting. Notice the International Harvester Company is a big one here. Obviously, they want to sell them what I call farm equipment. And apparently, with the Russians, they didn't have that type of technology. In fact, Russia itself is what I would call a country who lacked a lot of technology. It was not what I call a Western country. I mean, it was still backward. Okay, let's just call it what it is. Um, I don't know why it was that way. I know that I've had discussions with other people about this because it's always struck me that the Russians also would go to the French and have the French come there and design their buildings. In fact, many of the Russian buildings are actually um, were built by French architects or engineers. They loved the French designs very much so. That is the party that was in power at that time, not the communists, but the power before. Yes. So uh, it's just interesting to see how all this is going on. And it seems as though already there's an enormous cave in by Western powers already, not only because you can see the corporate powers are already having effects upon politicians already. And even though they're meeting and talking such and such, they know who these people are. Um, they are not getting what they want in some ways. And in some ways, I wonder if it's just simply doing their job, but not really actually preventing anything. Now, I could be wrong because I'm only in chapter 7 here. But there seems to be what I would call groups. They were allowing them to progress. And if it hadn't have been for the West, and the West helped these countries, helped Russia out many, many times. I should say the Soviet Union, many, many times. Okay, they did. They were one time had a famine, had some issues. It hadn't been for the United States, even in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and his would, we wouldn't do this, and yet they did do that. Farmers wanted to sell, wheat, whatever it takes, because all they care about is money. You see, it's not about what I call the real issue. So anyway, it's just interesting to see this because, and then I guess I knew that simply as there were actually, I studied this many years ago in college with a professor, Dr. Lumens, who was actually from Lithuania. No, yes, Lithuanian. He was from Lithuania, and he was a political science professor. I'm sorry, not a professor. He was a uh, history professor, but he was teaching German and Russian history. Probably the most worthwhile information I've gotten from a professor, brilliant guy, very good professor, a very hard professor, um, but I'm glad he was that hard because I learned a lot from him. So let's take a break, like I said, and we'll be back in a little bit, okay? Thank you for being here, and I wish you a good time. That is, a good night. Again, this information is simply for those who have ears to hear and have eyes to see. This has been going on for over 100 years, folks. So think about it. Thank you. Have a good night.